Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Bearcat Chats. I'm Jacob Wilkins, and today we are focusing on the vaccine for the coronavirus, and a pleasure to be joined by Nicole Hassoun, the professor of philosophy and leader of the Global Health Impact Project here at Binghamton, and two professors, clinical assistant professors to be exact, in the School of Pharmacy, Bennett Dowdy and Sarah Lynch. Thank you all for joining me. Sarah, I want to start with you. You are right on the front lines of distributing this vaccine and training other people on how to give out the vaccine. Tell me how it's going.
Yeah, so obviously this is a really hot topic right now. It's in the news everywhere. Currently, we are in the phased distribution of vaccinating. We started with healthcare workers, obviously, and vaccines were being given within inpatient settings. But this week's pretty exciting as we are going to start seeing those over 75 being able to get it at pharmacies. So I, in addition to the work that I do at the School of Pharmacy, one of my roles here being training students in how to immunize. We are also I also spend about 1 day a week at Wegmans Pharmacy, one of our local pharmacies here. I'm sure all of our students and faculty are aware of it, and so I've kind of been on the front lines there as we start to amp up and get prepared to do that vaccinating process. So definitely an exciting time. We have a lot of pharmacists who are looking to get trained right now. We're going to be doing a training for our local preceptors as well, because everyone's kind of angling for the shot, and it's kind of an all hands on deck time right now.
And Bennett, you focus on rural areas and the ways to provide healthcare to them. The biggest challenges I was reading, I think it was in Business Insider, your article, is communicating with them and making sure sort of the message gets out in terms of the important information, especially as it's evolving. How has that been?
So some of the barriers that we've seen in more rural areas, really across the US, like you've mentioned, are communication as well as just distribution, which I know, Sarah, you're very well aware of some of the distribution challenges with this different type of vaccine. But you mentioned communication being a big one. I practice actually in Sayre, Pennsylvania, which is a more rural area, but maybe not the stereotypical rural area you think of. And I've seen some of these issues kind of crop up in some of my patients where they receive their information from somewhat of a limited sources. So they might not have access to some of the mainstream media efforts that we have here in more of the developed areas. So they might have limited TVs or internet access. So they're receiving messages from different or more kind of narrow scopes. And actually, we found that a lot of patients receive their information from their healthcare providers, which are more limited in rural areas. So they don't have all that same information coming their way, which kind of changes their perceptions, their ability to really navigate the healthcare system, which is a huge, huge barrier there.
And I think to jump onto that, I think something you also talked about in that article, the barrier in those rural areas, and something we're hearing more about is the way this vaccine is distributed itself. There's a certain number of doses in each vial, but it expires once you puncture it for the first time within a few hours. So rural areas add that challenge of, do we have the right amount of eligible people here right now? If we're going to go puncture this vial, I have one patient in front of me. I need to find a few more now who can get that, who fall in our category. And that's when you're hearing those stories about vaccine doses being thrown away. It's not that, they're just random doses. It's that they expired before an eligible person was found. And fortunately, in that case, it even happened in cities, but that's, with smaller populations in rural areas, it also becomes even more of a problem.
I want to jump in and weave Nicole into the conversation. Nicole, I think most people, their thought is, how do I get this shot? And I think most people understand phases and essential workers and elderly getting it first. What have you seen in terms of how this is all executed?
I mean, I've been watching the vaccine distribution from an ethical perspective for a while and engaging, in some of that debate in public forums, through op-eds and so forth, about who should get it first and how we ended up giving it to the elderly. That was a very contentious issue initially. The CDC's straw vote for the distribution was not to give it to the elderly first. And people like me have been advocating for it. And so we saw that change happening. And so I think there's some really positive things. I think we need to have a lot more flexibility than we have had in terms of okay, there's not a 75-year-old around, but we don't want to let this go. And so I know that Cuomo in New York is loosening those guidelines, but I think it's really important ethically to make sure that vaccine distribution effort isn't, the vaccine's not going to waste. I work mostly on, global justice and thinking pretty broadly, pretty much beyond the confines of like the things that you guys are actually dealing with on the ground. And so the first question that comes to my mind when I hear you talk is, well, we're using this Pfizer vaccine, which is incredibly difficult, to keep in that cold chain storage. And why not use a manufacturing capacity that's, producing that Pfizer vaccine to produce the Moderna one, or maybe, a different one that doesn't require that kind of cold chain in the first place? And so the way that we've kind of set up the manufacturing and distribution systems, I think, is something we should think about better for future pandemics.
And one thing I use, I just want to personalize it to my parents. Now they are, and I got my mother's permission to share her age, which usually is not granted. My dad's 70, mom will be turning 70. Now they are snowbirds moving to Florida, and they say, well, I can get it sooner in Florida. Now I know things are constantly evolving, but they're at they're at an age where it seems like, hey, I'd like them to get the vaccine. So it seems like people are just trying to, they're just confused of, all right, how can I get it? When can I get it? Where do I qualify?
The CDC requirements, or the, I would say, guidance they put out is very broad, and some states are doing their own spin on that in a way. In New York, actually, I've been a little bit impressed, and I don't want to speak too much in Nicole's area, but they've actually set up 3 different task forces for distributing this, including the Clinical Advisory Task Force, Distribution and Implementation, as well as the Equitable Distribution Task Force. So they are actively working on how to tier this and really get it out there. But like you're saying, I mean, they might be different state to state. So it's really hard for people to also figure out when they can. The other cool thing New York State is doing is they're actually, if you go on the Department of Health website, you can actually check your eligibility pretty regularly, which isn't, the same thing to be said about every state. So I would encourage everyone, if they can, to regularly check their eligibility, because it's, like we mentioned, evolving pretty rapidly.
To all 3 of you, how do you reassure people that the vaccine is safe and effective?
One of the most common concerns I've heard, and perhaps others, have heard different, but one of the most common that I've heard at Wegmans has been, it was rushed, right? Like, we're hearing this happened so fast. And even myself, the fact that I hadn't even heard of this virus last year at this time, and now I have the shot in my arm. I mean, that's witchcraft almost. But my favorite thing to do is explain kind of the approval process and how that works. So normally we have phases as well. It seems to be the word of the day, phases of drug approval, right? So it first goes through a step of making sure this isn't going to kill anyone, it's safe. And then once it passes that step, then it enrolls more, the trials will enroll more people, and they'll make sure that it actually works. And then they enroll more people, and they monitor it for a long period of time. And then they get FDA approval, and then they start manufacturing it. But what we had a little bit different in this case is, because there was such an urgent need for these vaccines, we had the government step up and say, you know what, we're going to pay for it, whatever happens. And so instead of things happening after each other and taking a longer timeline, everything happened all at once. And so that has really shortened the timeline, but it doesn't mean that any steps were taken away. And so that, when I realized that and learned that, made me feel a lot more comfortable with it. And I've noticed that when I've told others that, and they were aware of that process and that it's really undergone all the steps that we usually require, it's definitely made them feel a lot more comfortable too. So that's usually one of the first things that I try to explain to people. It is still an emergency use authorization, so it's not actually an FDA approved vaccine yet. It's still undergoing some of the final monitoring that needs to take place. But the thing is, we have so many people who were enrolled in some of those early trials because they just wanted to help in some way, that the data we have is really strong, and we're able to make pretty good predictions on it because of those huge populations we were able to enroll in the studies.
And I just want to echo what you were saying, Sarah, with the fact that because the government stepped in and funded all of this research, that seldom happens, which is what led to a lot of the speed here too. The previous, record for a vaccine coming out was in 1967, and it took 4 years to develop the mumps vaccine. So 1967, I mean, a lot of my patients, I start with that too, saying that was a while ago, right? We've come a long ways, and the government funding it has really pulled a lot of these private organizations together, these drug companies together, to help get this vaccine technology out there. The other thing is, this mRNA vaccine is different in other ways that vaccines have been created in the past. So the mRNA technology was actually in development long before, say, this coronavirus reared its head, right? So we kind of step technology was already being developed midway, and that kind of also led to the fast-paced nature of it. But like you were saying, Sarah, no steps were skipped, and the efficacy data being upwards of 95% for both the Pfizer and Moderna is huge, right? And there's no major safety issues that we've really seen thus far, and they're really waiting on more of a longer-term data, I would say. I'm not sure if you agree. I think that's what I've seen, a lot longer-term safety and efficacy data, which we just given everyone. So that's one of the things, we just don't have it yet, right? And it's ongoing, but everything thus far has been very smooth.
I will say I was fortunate enough to get mine last week. So I got my first dose last week. I don't do same Bennett as well.
Yep, I got mine last week.
Yep. So had some arm soreness for a good 48 hours, totally gone within 48 hours. So I'm looking forward to dose number 2, got the Moderna one. So I will be getting that in early February. That one, we're hearing about some more side effects, and that's just the immune system amping up. Actually, I really shouldn't call it side effects. It is an expected immune response. It's not so much a side effect. So chills, kind of just feeling under the weather. We also see that in the pharmacy world and the medical world with vaccines that we use for the shingles shot, which is a 2-step shot. And people complain of the exact same things with their second shot there as well. It's just your body kind of doing what it's supposed to, which most of the time when people hear that, they feel a little bit more relieved. And I will say the other thing that as far as safety and concerns about the vaccine go, I do just want to get that out there, that the vaccine, when we talk about mRNA vaccines, the cool thing about that is that we're not actually injecting anyone with COVID. Even in an activated form of COVID. So even flu shots that we give nowadays are inactivated flu for the most part. And so that can kind of freak people out a little bit, having this, virus floating around in their body. But in this case, we are not actually injecting with any of the actual COVID itself. What we're doing is we're giving the body directions for recognizing the protein that coats the virus. And so that if the body comes in contact with that in the future, it can go ahead and attack it. Basically, it learns how to attack that outer protein layer. So that has also made some people feel a lot better as well when they hear that.
Yeah, Nicole, just hold on one second. We certainly want to get your thoughts on where we go from here. But Sarah, I think just to break it down for, putting herd immunity aside and when approvals come in aside, if someone is saying, is this a safe vaccine for me to get? The answer is
absolutely yes.
And that they should get
so safe, yeah. And certainly by far a better option than getting COVID.
The other thing that we really want to emphasize, and I emphasize with my patients who get it, who are about to get it, do this for not only yourself, but people around you. So the more we have vaccinated, you are keeping people around you safe too, and being an active part in fighting this pandemic. Even after you get vaccinated, though, it's really important to still wear a mask. We do not have enough data yet to say you can't spread it even after you've gotten vaccinated and are immune, let's say, to the coronavirus. So even after you get it, it's still essential to still wear a mask when you're in public and maintain distancing, because we're still trying to figure out what it means for longer term and spread.
Nicole, I like just feeding off of what Sarah and Bennett said, the idea of social distancing still being important after the vaccine. And it really goes to this global concept of we're still looking out for each other, and that there has to be a selfless nature as the pandemic continues, even if we are tired of it all.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how countries have invested in these vaccines to help bring them, to fruition very quickly. And there is a global, initiative called COVAX, where countries are collaborating, though the United States sadly has not joined, to try to get 20% of the global population vaccinated. And it needs more funding, it needs more support. My hope is that with the new administration, maybe we'll revisit that decision, because the European Union is leading the effort. Every country, China, Canada, there's many, many rich countries that have already joined. But at the same time, there's all this bilateral deal making, right? And countries are, there's 9 vaccines per person in Canada, right? And in the US, there's several vaccines per person that we have rights to. And I think we need to share that broadly, because it's a pandemic, right? If we don't reach that herd immunity, it's going to continue to circle the globe. It'll come back and threaten us as well. And also just because people, every person, I think, has a human right to health that we should be protecting. It shouldn't be the case that, somebody who's unfortunately, born in some part of sub-Saharan Africa never gets the vaccine.
Sarah Lynch, Bennett Dowdy, and Nicole Hassoun, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and providing really important information. and look forward to talking with you as the semester continues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.